Brexit is momentous and life-changing for Britain. The British people should be given a final say on whatever deal is negotiated. If they are allowed that say, then Brexit can be averted. And I and many others will work passionately for that outcome. But today, I want to say here in Brussels why Brexit is also bad for Europe and why European leaders share the responsibility to lead us out of the Brexit cul-de-sac and find a path to preserve European unity intact. For the first time since its inception, a nation, and a major one at that, will have disrupted the onward march of European cohesion, left the European Union, and will have done so apparently for reasons of principle at odds with the whole rationale for the Union's existence. Britain without Europe will lose weight and influence, for sure. But Europe without Britain will be smaller and diminished, also for sure. And both of us will be less than we are and much less than we could be together. In politics, there's a kind of fatalism which can often overwhelm what is right by making the right course seem hopeless or even delusional. So it is with Brexit. In the UK, we are told that the people have spoken and that to interrogate the question further is treachery. The will of the people is deemed clear and indisputable, though what that will means in practice, given the complexity of Brexit, the multiple interpretations of it, and the differing consequences of each version, is with every day which passes not clear at all. But nonetheless, we're told we must just do it. And in Europe, there is often a sorrowful shaking of heads and a shrugging of shoulders when what we need is strong, engaged leadership to avoid a rupture which will do lasting damage to us both. Now, I understand European reticence. Until Europe sees real signs that there could be a change of mind in Britain, why should it contemplate the possibility of change in Europe? However, the argument in Britain is far from over. Actually, right now it's in flux. See the speech of Jeremy Corbyn this week. What I call the dilemma of the negotiation, close to Europe to avoid economic damage, but therefore accepting its rules, or free from Europe's rules, but therefore accepting economic damage, is finally prizing open the discourse in Britain. And it's a binary choice. The cake will either be had or be eaten, but it won't be both. And the dilemma then divides the Brexit vote. Many of those who voted Brexit want a clean break from Europe, even if there's economic difficulty as a result, and even if it sours the politics of Ireland. But many others would not want it if there were an economic cost, and would certainly believe that peace in Ireland should be protected. Outside commentary often underestimates the fact that at some point this year, the government have got to put a vote to Parliament and win it. They will, of course, try to fudge. But as we are seeing, this cake is quite resistant to fudge. After last June's general election, winning this vote will be much tougher than is commonly understood. And for once, Parliament in this equation can be more decisive than either government or opposition. There are three legs to the stool upon which could sit a reconsideration of Brexit. The first is to show the British people that what they were told in June 2016 has turned out much more complex, more costly than they thought. This leg is looking increasingly robust as time goes on. The second is to show that there are different and better ways of responding to the genuine underlying grievances beneath the Brexit vote, especially around immigration. This leg is easy to construct, but needs willing workers. The third is an openness on the part of Europe to respond to Brexit by treating it as a wake-up call to change in Europe and not just an expression of British recalcitrance. This is the leg to focus on today. The stool needs all three legs. For Europe, the damage of Brexit is obvious and not so obvious. In obvious terms, though the economic pain for Britain, especially of a clean break Brexit, is large, the cost to Europe is also significant and painful. 1 in 7 German cars, for example, sold in Britain, and goods exports in total are worth 3.5% of German GDP. The figure for Ireland is 14%, for Belgium over 7%. Britain is a huge market for French produce of many kinds and a top 3 export partner for 10 EU members, including Italy and Spain. For example, around 200,000 Dutch jobs are involved in trade with the UK. There are some 60 direct flights between London and Amsterdam every day. According to the Dutch government agency CPB, a hard Brexit could make every Dutch person around 1,000 euros poorer. A Europe in which Britain finds it harder to be the financial centre for European business, it will be deeply damaging for Britain, but it will also impede the economy of Europe. Estimates of the long-term effect on European growth vary, depending on the version of Brexit chosen, but they vary from bad to very bad. In short, no one I've spoken to in the investment community, from the United States through to China, thinks this is a good idea for Britain or for Europe. Because of these effects, some in Britain believe that therefore Europe will bend its negotiating stance and allow Britain largely unfettered access to Europe's single market without the necessity of abiding by Europe's rules. This won't happen, quite simply because it can't. To do so would risk unraveling the single market and a return to precisely the system that was in place before Europe wisely and in the interests of its economy, and with, of course, the successive British governments urging, decided to create the single market. But the damage to Europe of a political nature is, to my mind, even more deleterious. For Schuman and other founding fathers, the project of European Union was a project of peace. Cooperation in Europe being the alternative to the wars which had ravaged Europe and the world in the first half of the 20th century. They looked back at the long history of European nations and saw centuries of conflict punctuated by all too brief epochs of relative harmony. From the time of Charlemagne, Europe had come together periodically, but mainly through religion, force, or transitory necessity. There had been an uneasy balance of power arrangement towards the end of the 19th century, but then the rivalries of the great European nations pitched them into a war no one ever thought would prove as devastating as it did. The attempt out of it, then to produce a new political settlement, fell victim to the competing totalitarian ideologies of communism and fascism and the descent into the darkness of World War II. So then, standing on the rubble of destruction, they decided to approach European unity with renewed vigor and vowed to give it institutional and practical meaning. Thus began what has now become the European Union. The rationale for Europe today, however, is not peace but power. For almost 300 years, the world has been dominated by the West. At the beginning of that time, the great powers were European, with colonies and empires. Japan and China were, of course, major nations, but they were not shaping the world. By the end of World War I, the United States had emerged as the most powerful nation, steadily eclipsing the United Kingdom, and stayed that way through the 20th century. But today, the world's changing again. China is today the second largest economy, the biggest global trader, and as holder of huge amounts of American debt, intimately important to global prosperity. Look back at the top economies in the year 2000, not so long ago. Europe dominates the top 10. Germany's was 4 times the size of India's and larger than China's. Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, distant specks on the horizon far behind. By 2016, the situation has already changed dramatically. India's economy is now almost as large as the UK and France. And by 2030, India's economy will be larger than those of Japan or Germany. Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico will be narrowing the gap. China becomes the largest global economy, 7 or 8 times the size of the UK. But then look ahead to 2050, and India is several times the size of the German economy, and no European economy is in the top 6. With this economic change will come political change. The West will no longer dominate. And Europe, to retain the ability to protect its interests and its values, will need to form a strong bloc with the power collectively to do what no European nation alone will be able to do individually. Regard the regions of the world today. Everywhere, in reaction to this fundamental shift of geopolitics, countries are banding together, from Southeast Asia to the continent of Africa. Nations are in a desperate scramble to find their place in a world in which no nation wants to be forced to choose between the big powers or unable to withstand their demands. For Europe, much more is at stake than trade or commerce. So take defense. Yes, NATO remains the cornerstone of Western security policy. But in an era in which the United States, and not only under this administration, is signaling the limits of its appetite for military commitment, and where current events in Turkey show the fragility of some of the assumptions of alliance within NATO, it's foolish, indeed it's dangerous, for Europe not to have the independent capacity to protect its interests. If the Sahel erupts, who will bear the brunt of the eruption? Europe. But who will we be obliged to call upon? The United States. Now, of course, Britain can maintain a close relationship on defense even outside the EU. It still represents 25% of European defense spending. I welcome the British Prime Minister's speech at the Munich conference and the excellent paper recently from the German Council on Foreign Relations. But how much more effective would such cooperation be if we were still part of Europe's decision-making structure? And instead we're in the surreal position of proclaiming our desire for tighter European cooperation in defense just as we withdraw from Europe's political framework for doing so. How can we police our borders except through common strategy? Or fight terrorism, but through enhanced integration of intelligence and surveillance? Or protect our privacy from either foreign governments or corporate behemoths, other than by the strength which comes from size? Do we seriously believe that if we had approached negotiation on climate change as individual countries rather than as Europe, we would have driven the agenda in the way that we did? But it's more than this. Our values are also going to be in play in the 21st century. Brexit is happening at a pivotal time in Western politics. Parts of our politics are today fragmented, polarized, occasionally paralyzed, with visceral cultural as well as economic rifts, with politicians who strive for answers swept aside by those riding the anger, a sterile policy agenda focusing on who to stigmatize and barely touching the real forces of change, which are technological, and conventional media, locked in an ugly embrace with social media to create a toxic, scandal-driven, rancorous environment for debate, which risks destruction of democracy's soul. Meanwhile, there are new powers emerging who are looking skeptically at Western democracy today and think there may be a different, less democratic model to follow. For the first time, not just our power, but our value system is going to be contested in the 21st century. So at this moment, we need for Europe to regain its confidence, to take courage, to set a course for the future, which rekindles the spirit of optimism. I believe firmly in the transatlantic alliance. Despite what it may sometimes seem, so do most Americans. In the new geopolitics, we need each other for reasons just as compelling as those which thrust us together in the early 20th century. But especially at a time when America appears preoccupied with its own political upheaval, and is hard to read and easy to parody, Europe should be far-sighted enough to keep the alliance strong, to be determined in defending our values from those who would destabilize us, and to send a message to the rest of the world that Europe will grow in power in the 21st century precisely because of those values. None of this can in any way be advanced by Britain's departure from Europe. It rips out of Europe one of the alliance's most sustained advocates. It weakens Europe's standing and power the world over. It reduces the effectiveness of the single market by removing from it Europe's second largest economy. And Britain, out of Europe, will ultimately become a focal point of disunity when the requirement for unity is so manifest. No matter how much we try, it will create a competitive pole to that of Europe, economically and politically, to the detriment of both of us. More contentiously, I believe it risks an imbalance in the delicate compromise that is the European polity. Britain supports the nation state as the point of originating legitimacy for European integration. Others are more comfortable with the notion of ever closer union, leaving over time to a more federal structure. But the truth is that the anxieties which led to the Brexit vote are felt all over Europe. They're not specific to the British. Read the latest Eurobarometer of public opinion. In many countries, similar referendums might have had similar results. Now look, I know from experience that Britain is often the argumentative partner who speaks up, but there is frequently a large group of others sheltering behind us, glad that there is a voice in the room articulating what others think but are shy of saying. Even the famed Franco-German motor can need British spare parts and lubricants, even if they come with the odd bit of grit. And from time to time, British mechanics can work with others to create a backup engine. President Macron has sensibly proposed a series of Europe-wide debates on Europe's future in recognition of these strains in European politics. But these will not work, however, if they become merely a way of explaining to European citizens why their worries are misplaced. It should be a real dialogue. The populism convulsing Europe must be understood before it can be defeated. Immigration is a genuine fear with causes which cannot be dismissed. Many feel the European project is too much directed to the enlargement of European institutions rather than to projects which deliver change in people's daily lives. There is much good work done by this and the previous Commission to reduce regulation and bureaucracy, unfortunately usually ignored or overshadowed. But we should recognize this is still an issue to people all over Europe. The things Europe is doing to build its capability to make the lives of Europeans better in energy, digitalization, infrastructure, education, defense and security need to be driven forward with much greater intensity. And the difference between those in the Eurozone and those outside it will require different governance arrangements. So Europe knows it needs to reform. And reform in Europe is key to getting Britain to change its mind. There should surely be a way of aligning those two perspectives. A comprehensive plan on immigration control, which preserves Europe's values, but is consistent with the concerns of its people and includes sensitivity to the challenges of freedom of movement principles, together with a roadmap for future European reform, which recognizes the issues underpinning the turmoil in traditional European politics and is in line with what many European leaders are already advocating. That would be right for Europe and timely for the evolving British debate on Brexit. If at the point Britain is seized of a real choice, not about whether we like Europe or not, the question of June 2016, but whether on mature reflection, the final deal the British government offers is better than what we have now. If at this moment, Europe was to offer a parallel path to Brexit of Britain staying in a reforming Europe, that would throw open the whole debate to transformation. Now, people will say it can't happen. To which I say, in these times of politics, anything can happen. In any event, it depends on what magnitude of decision you think this is. There are errors in politics of passing significance, and there are mistakes of destiny. If we believe, and I do, that this is of the latter kind, we cannot afford passive acquiescence. Those whose vision gave rise to the dream of a Europe unified in peace after centuries of war, and whose determination translated that dream into practical endeavor, theirs are the ghosts that should be our inspiration today. They would not have yielded to fatalism, and neither should we. We have months, perhaps weeks, to think, plan, and act. And let's be clear about one final thing. Even if Brexit is Britain's future, and yours is a European Union without Britain, we can't alter our geography, history, or manifold ties of culture and nature. This is a divorce that can never mean a physical separation. We will be consigned to cohabiting the same space, trying to get along, but resenting our differences and reliving what broke us apart. Awkward silences at the breakfast table, arguing over the rules with no escape from each other. And here is the supreme irony, actually with so much still in common and still liking each other. So better to make our future work together. If we don't, I believe in time a future generation will, but their verdict on ours will be harsh, for time wasted and opportunity spurned. It doesn't take a miracle. It takes leadership. And now is when we need it. Thank you.